The overnight caretaker listing for St. Regis Valley Medical Center had been posted on the Regional Nursing Staffing Board for 6 weeks before I finally opened it, mostly because the hourly rate attached to it looked like a typing mistake someone had never bothered correcting. I had graduated as a licensed practical nurse the previous spring, and between tuition and the semester I repeated while my mother was sick, I was carrying just under $43,000 in loan debt that grew heavier every month. The posting asked for a nurse willing to work 6 months of overnight shifts in a long-term unit called Ward C, live within driving distance of Tupper Lake, and accept limited contact with hospital administration outside of one weekly check-in call. In exchange, it offered $62 an hour, paid every single Friday, regardless of how many patients happened to be on the unit that particular week, which was nearly triple what I was making at the clinic. I called the number at the bottom of the listing on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, expecting some kind of staffing recruiter, and instead reached a woman who introduced herself as Ruth Callahan, the nursing director for the overnight unit. She asked me 3 careful questions about my licensure, my availability, and how comfortable I was working entirely alone, then told me the position was mine if I still wanted it once I had toured the facility myself. Ward C was a small unit of long-term unresponsive patients, she explained, requiring mostly vitals checks and quiet vigilance, the sort of steady, uneventful work most young nurses found boring inside of a month. When I asked why the hospital did not simply hire someone local through a regular staffing agency the way every other unit did, she told me turnover on that particular floor had been a problem for years. People brought in from outside the county, she explained, tended to arrive without any preconceptions about the place already sitting in their heads, which apparently made them easier to keep on staff long term. I drove up to Tupper Lake for the tour on a gray Thursday morning in the middle of October, passing the lumber yards and the boarded-up motels strung out along Route 30, until the pavement finally gave way to state forest at the edge of town. St. Regis Valley Medical Center turned out to be a squat brick building dating back to the late 1950s, with a newer wing bolted onto its east side sometime during the 1990s, according to the cornerstone by the entrance. Ruth Callahan met me in the lobby in person, a tall woman somewhere between 50 and 70 years old, her steel gray hair pulled back so tightly against her scalp that it looked genuinely painful to wear all day. She walked me through the ordinary parts of the hospital first, the emergency department, the general medical floor, and a small maternity ward that delivered maybe 30 babies a year. All of it tired-looking the way rural hospitals in small counties always seem to be. Ward C sat behind a badge-locked set of double doors at the far end of a third-floor corridor, and when Ruth finally pushed them open, I found 6 beds arranged along the walls of a dim, quiet room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something underneath it I could not immediately name. Every patient had clearly been there a long time, their skin thin and pale under the fluorescent lighting but carefully kept from breaking down, the kind of attentive care that takes years of practice to maintain properly. Ruth explained they were coma and persistent vegetative state patients. Several of them transferred here decades earlier once other facilities in the region stopped being willing to keep them on their own books any longer. The hospital kept the unit running as a kind of charitable obligation, she told me, even though by her own admission it barely covered its own operating costs most years and existed mainly out of old habit. She told me the overnight job itself was simple enough on paper, checking each patient every 2 hours, logging vitals by hand, repositioning anyone at risk of pressure sores, and calling the on-call physician if a reading ever looked wrong. It sounded manageable enough that I signed the 4-page contract on a clipboard right there in the hallway, my hand shaking slightly as I pictured my loan balance finally starting to shrink for the first time in 2 years. A handful of clauses in that contract struck me as strange, even as I initialed past each one without asking many questions. Too eager by then to slow myself down over a few paragraphs of legal language. I was not to discuss Ward C or its patients with anyone outside the hospital under any circumstances, and every piece of communication with administration would run through Ruth personally rather than the normal chain of command. Leaving the position before the 6 months were finished meant forfeiting any wages I had not yet been paid. But at $62 an hour, I told myself walking away early was never going to be a problem I would actually have to sit down and think about. My first night on the unit fell on the 14th of October, a Monday, and I arrived at St. Regis Valley a little before 11 in the evening, carrying a tote bag of paperback novels and protein bars, since Ruth had warned me the vending machines on that floor had been broken for years. The nurse finishing the evening shift, a heavy-set woman named Renata Ostrowski, who had worked at the hospital for almost 20 years, walked me through the handoff quickly and without much warmth in her manner. She showed me the vitals log, the medication card, and the call button system, then glanced at the clock and told me she needed to get going before her ride home left without her out front of the building. Something in the way she avoided looking directly at the 6 beds while she talked made me wonder if she was more eager to leave the floor itself than to catch any particular ride waiting for her outside. Alone for the first time, I did my rounds exactly as trained, checking each patient's chart against their wristband to make sure I had matched the right name to the right face before writing anything down. I noted blood pressure and oxygen saturation and skin condition in a paper logbook, since the unit had never been added to the hospital's electronic charting system, a detail Ruth had mentioned almost proudly during the tour rather than as something worth questioning. The patients ranged in age from what looked like their 40s to what might have been their 80s, and their charts listed admission dates that stretched back further than I expected walking in that first night. One man named Walter Kessler had an admission date of 1971 clipped to his bed rail, which would have made him well past 100 years old already if that paperwork were taken at face value. I chalked the discrepancy up to decades of imperfect record-keeping rather than anything worth losing sleep over on my very first shift in an unfamiliar building full of sleeping strangers I had only just met. Around 3 in the morning, I settled into the small nurse's station at the center of the room with my paperback novel and a cup of coffee I had brought from home in a battered thermos jug from college. The quiet of the place started to feel less peaceful and more heavy the longer I sat there, the kind of silence that made my own breathing sound far too loud in my own ears at that hour of the night. Alone. I told myself that was just nerves and unfamiliar surroundings working on my imagination, the way they always seem to do during a first night shift spent somewhere new and unfamiliar to a person like me. The first 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary once I got used to the isolation of it, driving up from Saranac Lake each evening as the sun went down and driving home again as the sky started to lighten over the tree line. I slept through most of the daylight hours in an apartment that began to feel increasingly disconnected from the rest of my life. My friends keeping daytime schedules I no longer shared with any of them. Small things started to bother me during those first weeks, nothing I could point to directly, just a slow accumulation of details that did not sit right no matter how many reasonable explanations I tried out for size. The elevator at the end of the Ward C corridor, marked for staff and supply use only, had a button on its panel labeled with the letter B and the number 2. Even though the hospital directory in the main lobby only listed a single basement level for the whole building. When I asked Ruth about it during one of our brief weekly check-in calls, she told me it was an old mechanical level from the original 1950s building, sealed off for safety reasons decades earlier, and that the button had simply never been removed from the panel afterward. More than once during the dead hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, I heard what sounded like humming coming from somewhere inside the ceiling vents above the nurse's station, a low, tuneless sound rising and falling in a pattern too regular to be the building's own ventilation system working. Whenever I got up to investigate where exactly the sound was coming from, it always seemed to stop just before I could pin the source down to any single vent or duct in the ceiling above the nurse's station. I also noticed the patients, despite being listed as comatose or in a persistent vegetative state, occasionally shifted position between my rounds in ways that felt inconsistent with total unresponsiveness. An arm that had been resting at a patient's side would be found across their chest an hour later, or a head that had been turned toward the window would be facing the door instead when I came back through. I attributed these small changes to muscle spasms or some kind of reflexive movement, the kind of thing any nursing textbook has, a tidy explanation for if you bother to go looking hard enough to find one. Tupper Lake itself was a small town of maybe 3,000 people spread out along the shore of the lake that gave it its name, with a single traffic light downtown and a hardware store that had been in the same family for 3 generations. There was also a diner called the Blue Line that seemed to serve the exact same handful of regulars every single morning without fail, rain or shine, winter or summer, the whole year through, without exception. I started stopping there most mornings on my way home from the hospital, ordering eggs and coffee and reading whatever paperback novel I happened to have brought along with me on any given particular week. Partly I did not want to drive straight home to an empty apartment, and partly sitting somewhere with other ordinary people around me helped settle whatever unease had built up over the previous night on the unit. The waitress who usually worked mornings, a woman named Deb who had grown up in town and knew practically everyone by name, eventually started making small talk with me about the weather and the road conditions. She also filled me in on whatever local gossip happened to be circulating around the whole town that particular week, among the same regulars who always sat at the counter right beside me each and every morning. I never once told her exactly where I worked, following the confidentiality clause written into my contract the way I had been very carefully instructed to, right from the very start of the whole thing. I let her simply assume that I worked some kind of general night shift somewhere at the hospital, vague enough to satisfy her own curiosity without crossing any line Ruth might have cared about at all. My days settled into a strange, inverted rhythm over those first few weeks that took real, sustained effort to adjust to properly, and I never quite fully managed to do it, if I am being truly honest here. I slept through the brightest hours of the afternoon behind blackout curtains I had bought specifically for that purpose, then woke around 6 each evening to shower and eat something small before leaving. The drive back up to Tupper Lake for another overnight shift took a little over 40 minutes each way. Longer still whenever the weather turned truly bad along Route 30 that entire long winter season. I spoke to my sister Callie on the phone most Sunday afternoons. The one single day of the week I always tried very hard to keep myself on something closer to a normal schedule than all the rest of them. That way, the two of us could actually catch each other awake at the very same time each week, since her own steady job kept her on a fairly ordinary daytime schedule down there in Plattsburgh year-round. I found myself editing my own descriptions of the job more and more carefully with each and every passing call, leaving out anything at all that might have made her worry unnecessarily about me back home. I told her simply that the pay was good and the work was quiet, both technically true statements that nonetheless left out everything that actually mattered about how those particular nights felt to me by then. My apartment itself sat above a hardware store on Main Street in Saranac Lake, a small one-bedroom unit with drafty windows and a radiator that clanked loudly whenever the heat kicked on late at night. Increasingly, I found myself avoiding the place during my limited waking hours, preferring the diner or the small public library instead of the silence of those 4 empty walls always closing in around me. I did my grocery shopping once a week at the Grand Union in Tupper Lake, rather than driving all the way back to Saranac Lake for it, usually stopping in around 4 in the afternoon before my shift started. It was during one of those ordinary grocery runs, sometime in late October, that I first noticed people in town seemed to react slightly differently once they learned or guessed where exactly I worked. The cashier who rang up my groceries that particular afternoon, an older woman with a name tag that read Sandy, asked me casually which specific department of the hospital I actually worked in that year. When I told her it was the overnight unit, up on the 3rd floor, something flickered briefly across her whole face before she caught herself and quietly returned to scanning my items without further comment. I did not think much of it in the moment, chalking it up to ordinary, small-town curiosity about hospital work in general, the kind any local resident might reasonably have about any newcomer to the area. But I noticed that same small flicker of reaction from at least 2 other people over the following weeks, whenever the subject of my job happened to come up in casual conversation somewhere around town. Looking back on all of it now, I understand that particular flicker for what it actually always was, a town's quiet, half-buried memory of something it had collectively decided not to discuss directly. It was the way people in small places sometimes agree, without ever really agreeing out loud about it, to simply let certain subjects lie undisturbed for the sake of everyone's own comfort and peace of mind. The incident that finally made it impossible to keep explaining things away happened on a Wednesday night near the end of my 3rd week, during my 2 o'clock round on a patient named Dorothy Fenn in the corner bed. She was an elderly woman whose chart listed an admission date of 1983, and who had never once twitched during any of my previous checks on her since I had first started working on that floor. I was adjusting her pillow the way I had been trained to prevent pressure sores when her eyes opened part way. Not fully, just enough to catch the dim light spilling in from the hallway behind me at that moment. In a voice that sounded dry and unused, like a door hinge nobody had bothered oiling in years, she said my name, Dana, clear as anything spoken by a fully conscious person standing right beside me in the room. I had never once introduced myself out loud to any of the patients during my rounds, and my name badge stayed clipped to the inside of my scrub pocket the entire shift, tucked where nobody lying in a bed could possibly have read it from across the room. I froze completely for what felt like a full minute, my hand still resting on her pillow, unable to make myself move even an inch away from the bed or call out down the hallway for anyone else to come help me. By the time I found the nerve to speak back to her and ask if she could hear me, her eyes had already drifted shut, and her breathing had returned to the same slow, mechanical rhythm it had held for the entire 3 weeks I had watched over her. I did not sleep at all that following day, running the moment over and over in my head and trying to convince myself I had imagined it or misheard some ordinary ambient sound as though it were my own name spoken clearly. By the time my next shift started the following evening, I had already decided I needed to start asking somebody at the hospital some serious questions about what exactly I had heard her say to me that night. Whatever explanation existed for a woman supposedly unresponsive for over 40 years knowing my first name, it was not going to be one I found written anywhere in her chart or logged in the hospital's own paperwork. I started my search for answers the following week during one of the rare overlaps when Renata Ostrowski was still finishing her paperwork as I arrived from my shift, catching her alone at the nurse's station before Ruth's usual evening phone call came through the front desk line. When I mentioned what had happened with Dorothy Fenn, Renata's hands went completely still over the chart she had been holding, and she did not say a single word back to me for a while, just staring at the floor. After a long pause, she told me quietly that she had worked Ward C herself for almost a full year back in the early 2000s, before finally requesting a transfer down to the general medical floor for reasons she still would not discuss with me. She said she still would not talk about specifics because of the confidentiality clause written into her own contract, the same one I had signed myself, though she said enough to make clear I was not the first caretaker to have an experience like mine on that particular floor. Most people who lasted more than a few months on that unit, she told me, eventually had one of their own sooner or later, whether they wanted it or not, and there was not much anyone could do to prevent it once it started happening to them. She would not tell me what had made her request the transfer in the first place, only that I should keep a personal log of anything unusual, kept separate from the official hospital paperwork I filled out every night for administration to review. If I ever felt like I needed to leave the unit for good, she added, I should do it during daylight hours right after finishing a shift, never in the middle of the night while the building was still dark and quiet around me. She delivered that particular piece of advice with enough seriousness in her voice that I did not push her to explain it any further in the moment, though I wrote it down word for word the second I got home that morning. That same week, I drove to the Tupper Lake Free Library on my day off and asked the reference librarian, a retired school teacher named Phyllis Granger, who had lived in town her entire life, whether she knew anything at all about the history of the hospital building itself before it became a hospital. She directed me to a set of local history binders kept in a back storage room, filled with newspaper clippings and old photographs the Historical Society had collected over several decades of careful, patient work by volunteers. That material turned out to answer questions I had not even known enough yet to ask, questions that had been sitting quietly underneath everything strange I had noticed so far, without my realizing it, waiting patiently for someone to finally go looking for them on purpose. The binders told me that St. Regis Valley Medical Center had been built in 1957 on the exact site of an earlier institution called the Piercefield State Sanatorium, a tuberculosis hospital that had operated there since 1922. It closed abruptly in 1954, a closure the local paper at the time described only obliquely as the result of an administrative scandal involving the facility's own longtime medical director. That director, according to a yellowed clipping from the Tupper Lake Free Press dated March of 1954, was a physician named Dr. Aldous Whitmore, who had run the sanatorium for over 2 decades by that point. An unnamed source quoted directly in the article claimed he had been conducting unauthorized treatment trials on long-term patients, using an experimental compound of his own design that had never received proper approval from anyone. The article stayed frustratingly vague about what exactly happened to the patients caught up in those trials, stating only that an internal investigation had been launched after several long-term residents went missing from the facility's own records. No documented discharge or death certificate had ever been filed for any of them with the county clerk's office. As far as the reporter had been able to determine at the time that particular article went to print. Dr. Whitmore had resigned his position abruptly before that investigation could ever be completed, according to the same article, and within the year, the sanatorium was shuttered entirely and left to sit empty. The state quietly demolished most of its original buildings not long afterward, leaving only the old foundation, the one the new hospital would eventually be built directly on top of a few years later on. A second clipping dated sometime in 1956 mentioned that Whitmore himself had died the following winter, under circumstances the local paper described only as sudden and entirely unexpected at the time. His personal papers and research notes had apparently never been recovered by the state health department, despite what the article called an extensive search of the entire property after his death that winter. That last detail sat uneasily in my stomach as I stood in the back room photocopying every page in the binder I could find related to the old sanatorium and its abrupt closure decades earlier than that. Somewhere out front I could hear Phyllis moving around as she began closing up the reference room for the evening, well ahead of the library's early Thursday closing time posted on the front door of the building, armed with Dr. Whitmore's full name and the handful of dates I had copied down from those newspaper clippings. I spent my next few days off trying to track down anyone still living in the area who might remember the old sanatorium directly. I went door to door at the senior center in town, asking careful, roundabout questions of anyone who looked old enough to have actually lived through that particular period of the town's own history themselves. Eventually, a cousin of Renata's mentioned, almost in passing during a conversation I had steered deliberately in that direction over coffee at the diner on Main Street, that a woman named Loretta Sabo lived out past Piercefield. Loretta lived on a stretch of Route 30 near the old rail bed, and had worked at St. Regis Valley Medical Center herself decades earlier, and was known around town for not much liking unexpected visitors showing up at her door uninvited. She told me Loretta had left the hospital under circumstances nobody in town seemed to fully understand or particularly care to talk about at any real length over coffee at the diner that particular morning. Most people who brought the subject up with her directly, she added, tended not to bring it up with her again after that first and only conversation about it, which never went anywhere useful for anyone. The following week, I drove down to the Franklin County Clerk's office in Malone, a squat brick building not far from the county courthouse, hoping the official vital records might tell me something the newspaper binders back in Tupper Lake had left frustratingly vague or incomplete. The records clerk named Barbara, a heavy-set woman close to retirement age who had clearly fielded plenty of strange requests over her many years behind that particular counter, greeted me warmly enough. She pulled up what she could find on patients discharged from the Piercefield State Sanatorium between 1945 and its eventual closure in 1954 and warned me up front that record-keeping from that era was spotty at best. It was especially bad, she said, for a state-run facility that had closed under something close to a full cloud of scandal, though she promised to do whatever she could to help me track down anything useful in the archive. What she eventually found, after nearly 2 hours of searching through microfilm and yellowed index cards stored in the basement of that building, was a partial list of 11 patients whose sanatorium records simply stopped mid-file sometime in the early 1950s. No discharge paperwork and no death certificate had ever been filed for a single one of them anywhere in the entire county's own official records, as far as she was able to tell me that particular afternoon. Among those 11 names was a woman named Agnes Whitcomb, admitted to the sanatorium in 1946 for tuberculosis treatment, and beside her name someone had written a small pencil notation in the margin that simply read "transferred to observation." That particular phrase appeared nowhere else in any of the surrounding paperwork that Barbara could manage to locate for me that day, no matter how hard she looked through the entire surviving case file. When I asked her directly what that particular word observation might actually have referred to in a 1940s sanatorium context, she said she genuinely did not know it all herself, truly and plainly. That particular phrase was simply not standard terminology for any tuberculosis treatment protocol she had personally ever come across in her many years of working with these particular county archives. I copied down all 11 names before I finally left that office, along with whatever scraps of biographical information Barbara had managed to locate for each of them in the surviving county paperwork. Most had been ordinary people from ordinary towns scattered around the North Country. Farmers and mill workers and one school teacher from Malone itself, all of them admitted for treatment of a disease that, at the time, still killed a meaningful percentage of the people who contracted it. None of their families, as far as the county records could tell me, had ever filed a formal complaint or pursued any legal action after their relatives disappeared from the sanatorium's own books without explanation. Barbara suggested gently that families in that era were sometimes simply relieved to stop paying for a relative's ongoing care and did not always ask too many hard questions when a state institution informed them a loved one had been transferred somewhere else for further treatment. I drove back toward Tupper Lake that evening, turning those 11 names over and over in my head, wondering how many of them, if any, might still be lying in bed somewhere inside that hospital, decades later. Perhaps they were still waiting on some level of that building for a caretaker who had not even been born yet, when they were first admitted for treatment that never actually cured them of anything at all. I found Loretta Sabo's trailer on a Saturday afternoon in early November, set back from the road behind a stand of bare birch trees that had already dropped most of their leaves for the season by then. When I knocked, she answered the door slowly, a small woman in her 80s, with sharp eyes that studied me for a long moment before she asked, in a voice carrying more suspicion than surprise, whether I was the new one working nights on Ward C now. That question told me she already knew exactly why I had come looking for her before I had said a single word about the hospital, or about Dorothy Fenn, or about anything else that had happened to me over the past few weeks. Loretta let me inside and made a pot of coffee neither of us actually drank, and once we were seated across from each other at her kitchen table, she told me she had worked that same overnight caretaker position I now held for almost 11 years, starting back in 1979. That was longer than anyone else she knew of before or since had ever managed to last on that particular floor of the hospital, and she said it with a strange, flat pride that did not seem to bring her any real comfort at all. She said she had only left the job when her own health finally forced her into an early retirement, one she admitted she had not entirely chosen for herself when it actually came right down to deciding. When I asked her directly about Dorothy Fenn saying my name out loud, and about the elevator button for a basement level that supposedly did not exist anywhere in the building's records, Loretta's expression did not change at all. It was as though she had been waiting 11 years for someone to finally sit down across from her and ask those exact questions out loud, in her own kitchen, over coffee neither of us would ever actually finish drinking together. She told me that everything I had noticed so far was only the smallest, gentlest part of what that hospital had been quietly sitting on top of since long before either of us was even born into the world. Loretta would not tell me everything that day, saying only that some things needed to be seen with my own eyes rather than explain to me secondhand if I was ever going to actually believe any of it myself. She did confirm that the sanatorium scandal I had read about in the library binders was entirely real, every last word of it, and that Dr. Whitmore's experimental compound had not killed the patients he tested it on the way the official record seemed to imply to anyone reading it casually. What it had done to them instead, she said, was something she still did not have the right words for, even after all these years of turning it over quietly in her own mind, alone out here in this trailer. She told me that Ruth Callahan had been the nursing director on Ward C since before Loretta herself had even started working there back in 1979. A claim that did not make any real arithmetic sense at all given how old Ruth would have to be by now if that were actually true. When I pointed this discrepancy out to her directly, Loretta just looked at me for a long, quiet moment and said only that I would understand more the longer I stayed working on that floor of the hospital. Still, she strongly urged me to finish out my 6 months and leave the very moment my contract ended, rather than accepting any kind of extension Ruth might eventually offer me somewhere down the line. In her own experience, she said, the ones who stayed on past their original term rarely left that hospital again at all. Not really. Not in any way that actually counted as truly leaving for good this time. Before I left her trailer that afternoon, Loretta gave me one more piece of advice I did not fully understand until several weeks later, once I had finally seen it all for myself with my own 2 eyes. She told me that if I ever found myself down on the level marked with the letter B and the number 2, I should never, under any circumstances, read anything I found down there out loud to myself or to anyone else. It was a warning so oddly specific and so strange that it stayed lodged in the back of my mind through every single shift I worked for the rest of that month, even as nothing in particular happened on the unit to bring it back to the surface of my thoughts. The storm that changed everything rolled into Tupper Lake on the second night of December, A nor'easter the local forecasters had been warning about for days straight on every radio station I could find while driving up from Saranac Lake that evening. It dumped close to 18 inches of snow on the town by midnight and knocked out power to most of the county, including the hospital's main electrical grid, which switched over automatically to backup generators that kept the essential systems running. Those generators dimmed the hallway lighting throughout the entire building to something closer to candlelight, casting long, uneven shadows down every corridor I could see from the nurses' station where I sat. I was alone on Ward C when the power first flickered, as I always was at that hour. And in the sudden near darkness that followed, I heard something I had never once heard on that unit before. In all my weeks there, a low, overlapping murmur rose from all 6 beds at once. Not quite forming words exactly, more like the sound 6 different people might make, trying to speak with their mouths only half open at the same time. It rose and fell together in a rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand straight up, well before I had even consciously registered what exactly I was hearing in that dim, generator-lit room around me. When I turned my flashlight across the room, every one of the 6 patients had their eyes wide open, all of them fixed not on me but on the far wall near the sealed elevator at the end of that corridor. Dorothy Finn's hand had risen slightly off the blanket, her fingers curling and uncurling in a slow, deliberate motion that looked less like a muscle spasm and more like someone counting down from a number only she alone could see clearly. I backed slowly toward the nurse's station to call the front desk for help, but the internal phone line was already completely dead, along with half the hospital's other backup systems that night in the storm. By the time I looked up again from the dead receiver in my hand, the murmuring had already stopped as abruptly as it had started, and every one of the patients' eyes had closed once more in their beds. The room had returned to its usual mechanical silence, except for the steady beeping of the monitors, leaving me standing there with my flashlight shaking badly in one hand, and absolutely no way to prove to anyone else what exactly I had just witnessed happen in that room. I should have called it a night right then and waited out the rest of the storm at the nurse's station until my relief finally arrived at 7 that morning, the way any reasonable person in my position probably would have done without a second thought. But something about Loretta's warning and the strange, deliberate way Dorothy Finn's fingers had moved in that dim light pulled at me until I found myself walking toward the sealed elevator at the end of the hall instead of staying put. I told myself I only wanted to check that the doors were still locked tight, the way they always had been, every single night since I had first started working there back in the middle of October that year. The call panel lit up the moment I pressed the button, something it had never once done in almost 2 full months of me working on that floor of the hospital before that particular stormy night in December. Before I could second-guess the decision building quietly in my chest, the doors slid open onto a small, dust-covered car that smelled faintly of mildew and something colder underneath it that I could not name. The button marked with the letter B and the number 2 glowed faintly on the dusty panel, as though it had been patiently waiting a very long time for someone to finally reach out and press it down at last. I rode down in a silence broken only by the grinding of old cables somewhere far above the car. And when the doors finally opened again, I found myself standing in a corridor that bore no resemblance to anything in the modern hospital above me. Bare concrete walls lined a row of small rooms that still held the iron-framed beds and barred windows of an institution that had clearly been built decades before I had even been born into this world. The dust lay thick enough on the floor that my footsteps left clear prints behind me, leading deeper into a darkness my flashlight could only partially cut through, no matter how I angled the beam of it. Some of the rooms held nothing but rusted equipment and rotted mattress frames that had slowly collapsed in on themselves after decades of sitting untouched down there in the dark and the bitter cold. Others held things I still have real trouble describing clearly even now, months later, sitting somewhere far safer and warmer, trying to put the whole ugly memory into words that make any sense at all. Restraints hung bolted to the walls at heights that did not match any ordinary hospital bed I had ever once seen or worked around during any of my nursing training up to that particular point in my life. Medical instruments sat arranged neatly on metal trays, as though someone had only just stepped away from them a moment before I happened to walk slowly past that one particular open door in the dark. In one room near the far end of the corridor, a wall stood covered floor to ceiling and names written out in a cramped, looping hand that filled every inch of available space from the baseboard to the ceiling tiles. There were dozens and dozens of names crowded together, some crossed out entirely, some circled twice over in heavier ink, running back further than I had the courage to trace with my shaking flashlight in that particular moment alone down there. I made myself keep moving instead of standing there reading names I was fairly sure I did not actually want to know the full truth behind just yet. Not with the storm still raging somewhere far above my head. In a small office near the very far end of that basement corridor, tucked behind a door someone had left slightly ajar, as though they had been expecting me to eventually come find it, I found a heavy wooden desk. A leather-bound ledger sat open on top of that desk, alongside a stack of loose papers held together with a single rusted paperclip that had gone brown with age and years of accumulated basement moisture. The top page of that stack had been written in the very same fountain pen script I recognized immediately from the wall of names I had just passed further back down the corridor behind me in the dark. My hands were shaking badly enough by that point that I nearly dropped my flashlight twice, just trying to pick the ledger up off the desk and get a proper look at what exactly it contained inside its worn, cracked leather cover. The ledger turned out to be a running log of every overnight caretaker who had worked what the old records referred to only as the observation post, going back all the way to 1957, the same year the new hospital above me had first opened its doors to the public. It listed names, start dates, and end dates in neat, careful columns that ran down page after page in that same looping fountain pen script, and running my finger down the list I found Loretta Sabo's own name exactly where she had told me it would be waiting. Her entry read 1979 through 1990, followed by a small handwritten notation that simply said, "Released early, medical." A phrase that did not match at all the way she had described her own departure to me across her kitchen table only days earlier. Further down that same page, more recent than I had expected to find anyone I actually recognized, I found Renata Ostrowski's name covering roughly 11 months sometime in the early 2000s, exactly as she herself had told me back at the nurse's station. Below that entry ran a long string of other names I did not recognize at all, each one lasting anywhere from a few short months to, in a small handful of cases, well over a full decade of continuous service on that same unit upstairs. Every single line in that entire ledger had been signed off at the very bottom in the same identical handwriting, initialed simply with the letters R and C. A set of initials I did not need Loretta to explain to me once I finally saw them printed there in ink. That ink looks no older and no newer than any other entry on the page, despite what had to be decades separating the very first line from the very last one I could find printed there inside that old ledger. I sat crouched there, on the cold concrete floor of that basement office for what must have been close to 20 minutes, just staring at those initials and trying to force the arithmetic in my head to come out to any answer that made sense. Ruth Callahan had told me herself, back during my very first tour of the hospital, that she had been the nursing director of Ward C for a long time, though she had never once specified exactly how long that particular stretch of time had actually been. If the initials in that ledger truly belonged to her, and I could not think of a single other explanation that fit the facts sitting right there in front of me, then she had been signing off on every single caretaker's departure from that unit since 1957. That worked out to a span of nearly 70 years by my own careful count, sitting there alone in the dark of that little basement office trying to make the stubborn numbers finally behave themselves for me. No woman who looked the way Ruth Callahan looked, somewhere between 50 and 70 years old, at the absolute most by any reasonable guess, could possibly have been working steadily at any single job for 70 uninterrupted years. Someone in a town this small would eventually have noticed something deeply wrong and said so out loud to somebody else about it, surely at some point over the course of all those many strange years. I told myself there had to be a family connection of some kind that I simply was not seeing yet. A daughter or a granddaughter who had taken over the same initials and the same job title from an older relative at some point along the way. That explanation felt thin even as I turned it over in my own head. But it was the only one that let me set the ledger back down on the desk and keep functioning normally enough to finish out the rest of that long, strange night. The loose papers beneath the ledger turned out to be a letter, undated but written in handwriting I recognized from the newspaper clippings as belonging to Dr. Aldous Whitmore himself, addressed to no one in particular that I could find anywhere on the page. It read more like a private confession than any kind of ordinary correspondence, written in a controlled, almost clinical tone that felt strange given everything else I had already seen down there in that basement that night. Whitmore wrote that the compound he had developed and tested on his sanatorium patients back in the 1940s had not cured them, and had not killed them either, the way either a success or a failure by any normal medical standard really should have. Instead, he wrote, it had suspended something inside each of them permanently, caught between those two states in a way modern medicine at the time had no real name or framework for describing properly. This suspended condition, he claimed, no longer required food or air or even a properly functioning body to persist on its own indefinitely, bound instead to the physical location where the original treatments had first been administered to each patient. Whitmore wrote that he had discovered too late to undo any of what he had already done to those poor people, that this suspended state required a kind of living anchor to remain stable over any real length of time. He described that anchor as a single living person present on the property through the deep, quiet hours of the night, every single night without exception and without any real interruption of length at all. Without that anchor in place, he wrote, the patients grew agitated and restless and became increasingly capable of extending their influence out beyond the very walls that were supposed to contain them safely. That was the real reason, he explained, that he had begun assigning a dedicated overnight attendant to the ward himself, even before his own methods ever came under any official scrutiny from the state. He wrote that he did not know how long the arrangement would need to continue or what would eventually become of the patients themselves after enough years had finally passed for any one of them individually. He only knew, in his own careful words, that the anchor and the thing being anchored were slowly becoming less distinguishable from one another, the longer any single attendant remained in that particular role on the ward. He described this as a process he had personally observed firsthand in at least two of his own staff members, back before his resignation was finally forced through by the state health board that year. He stopped short, though, of ever describing exactly what that process actually looked like once it finally reached its own natural conclusion for any one particular person caught up inside of it all. The final page of the letter, shorter than the others and written in a noticeably shakier hand than the rest of the document, read almost like an apology directed at whoever might eventually find these particular papers sitting down here waiting for them. Whitmore wrote that he had tried, near the very end of his own life, to find some way to sever the connection between the ward and the patients trapped inside its particular kind of suspension permanently. He believed he had failed completely, and that the arrangement he had built without ever fully understanding it himself would now simply continue on its own, indefinitely, long after he himself was gone from this world for good. I sat there in that basement office for what must have been close to an hour after finishing the letter, rereading certain passages of it by flashlight while the storm still raged somewhere far above my head through the concrete and steel of the building. I heard the elevator doors grind open again somewhere back down the corridor behind me while I was still sitting there with Whitmore's letters spread out across my knees, a sound that sent me scrambling immediately to gather the ledger and his papers together into the front of my jacket. I killed my flashlight at once and pressed myself hard into the darkest corner of that little office, listening as slow, deliberate footsteps made their way past the open door without ever once stopping to check inside. Those footsteps sounded wrong in a way I could not immediately place in the moment, too even and too patient, like something counting out its own steps carefully, rather than simply walking the way an ordinary person walks down a hallway. I waited until the sound had faded completely away before I let myself move again, creeping back toward the elevator on legs that did not feel entirely steady beneath me anymore after everything I had just seen and read down there. I rode back up to the third floor with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it pulsing in my own ears the entire way up, certain the doors would open onto something terrible waiting for me on the other side. When the doors finally opened onto Ward C again, though, I found all 6 patients lying exactly as I had left them hours earlier, their eyes closed and their breathing slow and mechanical as always, undisturbed. Nothing about the room suggested that any of them had so much as shifted in their sleep the entire time I had been gone downstairs, alone, in the dark, doing whatever it was I'd been doing down there. I no longer believed for a single second, standing there in that quiet room, that stillness meant what it was actually supposed to mean on that particular floor of the hospital anymore, not after that night. I went straight to Loretta's trailer the following afternoon, instead of going home first to sleep. The stolen ledger and Whitmore's letter wrapped carefully together inside a plastic grocery bag on the passenger seat beside me, the entire drive out past Piercefield that morning. When she opened her door and saw the look on my face, she did not seem surprised, so much as simply tired. The particular kind of exhaustion carried by someone who had been expecting this exact conversation for a very long time, and had only been hoping it would never actually come to pass. I laid the papers out across her kitchen table and asked her directly whether Ruth Callahan and the initials R and C written throughout that entire ledger truly belonged to one and the very same person. After a long silence at the table, Loretta finally admitted she did not know for certain herself, only that Ruth had looked exactly the same the day Loretta finally left the job back in 1990, as she had looked the very first day Loretta started working there in 1979. She said she had spent the better part of the last 30 years quietly telling herself it was simply a strong family resemblance passed down through some unbroken line of Callahan women who all happened to take the very same job title, one after another, generation after generation. Loretta then told me the real reason she had left the position so early, a detail she had deliberately held back during our very first conversation together in that same kitchen weeks earlier that fall. In her final months on the unit, she said, she had started forgetting things, small at first, a patient's name here, the correct date there, and then steadily larger things after that, entire shifts she could not account for afterward, no matter how hard she tried to remember them clearly. She described whole conversations with her own sister that she had absolutely no memory of ever having taken place at all, despite her sister swearing up and down that they had happened exactly as described. When she finally went to see a doctor down in Saranac Lake about it, he found nothing physically wrong with her at all. No stroke, no early dementia, nothing on any scan that could explain gaps in her memory that lined up almost exactly with the hours she had spent alone on Ward C each night. She told me she believed now, after decades of turning it over quietly in her own mind out here alone in this trailer, that Whitmore's letter had been telling the plain, ugly truth the whole entire time. Something about spending enough nights anchoring those patients slowly wore away the line between the anchor and the thing being anchored, she said quietly, staring down at her own folded, wrinkled hands. The reason she had never fully recovered those lost hours, even now, was that some small part of her had simply never actually left that hospital floor at all. Not really, not ever, not fully, not once. 3 nights after my visit to Loretta's trailer, everything on Ward C tipped over from unsettling into something I could no longer pretend was survivable. If I kept going the way I had been going, treating each strange night as somehow separate from the last one before it. That was making my 2 o'clock round on Walter Kessler, the man whose chart still listed that impossible admission date from 1971, when his hand shot out from beneath the blanket without any warning at all and closed hard around my wrist. The grip was far stronger than anything I would have believed a supposedly comatose body could still manage after all these years of lying motionless in that same narrow hospital bed of his, unmoving. His skin felt cold and slightly waxy against mine, nothing like the careful, warm care Ruth had trained me to maintain in every patient on that unit. And his eyes opened fully this time, alert in a way that had nothing to do with any coma I had ever studied. He did not say my name out loud the way Dorothy Fenn had weeks earlier, but instead spoke in a low, rasping voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in his chest than his own throat could reach on its own. It was almost time again, he told me, and I should stop fighting what was already well underway inside those walls, whether I actually understood any single part of it yet or not myself, right then and there. I wrenched my arm free hard enough to stumble backward into the medication cart, sending a tray of small paper cups skittering across the tiled floor in every direction around my feet as I nearly fell. By the time I caught my balance again, his hand had already dropped back down onto the blanket, his eyes sliding shut as though none of it had ever actually happened in that quiet room at all that night. My wrist ached badly for 2 full days afterward, and when I finally worked up the nerve to examine it closely under better light, I found 4 distinct bruises shaped like individual fingers pressed deep into my own skin. That was proof I could hold in my own 2 hands, undeniable and physical, that none of what I had experienced down there had simply been exhaustion or imagination working overtime on an already frightened mind. I did not go back to work the following night, calling in sick for the very first time since I had started the job back in October, and I spent most of that day sitting at my own kitchen table staring at those bruises and trying to think clearly. Venata had warned me, back during our very first real conversation together, that most people who lasted more than a few months on that unit eventually had an experience of their own to carry around with them afterward. I understood now, sitting alone in my apartment with the blinds drawn against the daylight, that mine had likely only just begun, rather than already reaching any kind of natural conclusion on its own. I thought seriously about simply not showing up again at all, about letting the remaining months of my contract and its forfeited wages become somebody else's problem entirely from that point forward. But even with everything I had seen and read and now physically felt in the bruised skin of my own wrist, the math of my remaining loan balance kept pulling me back toward finishing what I had already started, however foolish that particular impulse might have looked from any real distance. I called Ruth Callahan the following morning before I had even made myself a full pot of coffee, my hands still shaking slightly as I dialed the number I had memorized weeks earlier from the top of my contract paperwork. I told her flatly that I was resigning effective immediately and would not be returning for my scheduled shift that coming night, no matter what she said in response to try to change my mind about it. I expected an argument, or at the very least some real pushback about notice periods and professional obligations owed to the hospital and its remaining long-term patients on that ward upstairs on the 3rd floor. Instead, Ruth's voice on the other end of the line stayed perfectly calm and almost gentle, telling me she understood completely and that plenty of caretakers over the years had found the isolation of the position difficult to sustain over any real length of time. Then she added, almost as an afterthought tossed casually into the conversation, that the initial signing payment I had received back in October had technically been structured as an advance against the full 6-month term of my contract, rather than a separate signing bonus paid outright. That meant, she explained, that early departure from the position would trigger a repayment clause requiring me to return the entire advance within 30 days of my very last worked shift on the unit. The sum in question came to $11,200, an amount I did not have sitting anywhere in my bank account, having already spent most of it months earlier paying down a meaningful chunk of my own loan balance back home. When I asked her to explain how any of that was even possible, given what the contract I had actually signed seemed to say in plain language, Ruth suggested, still in that same calm and almost maternal tone of voice, that perhaps I should come into her office. There, she said, the two of us could review the actual paperwork together properly, in person, rather than trying to sort out something this complicated over the telephone with one another that morning. In the meantime, she added, it might be easier on everyone involved, myself included, if I simply finished out the remaining 4 months of my original term the way the two of us had originally agreed to it. The alternative, she reminded me gently, would leave me in a considerably worse financial position than the one that had brought me to the job in the first place, all the way back in October of that year. I sat at my kitchen table for a long while after hanging up the phone, staring at the wall and running through every version of the conversation I wished I had actually had with her instead of the one I had just finished having. $11,200 was not a number I could simply produce out of thin air within 30 days. Not without borrowing against a credit line I already had stretched dangerously thin from tuition costs and my mother's medical bills the year before. I thought about calling a lawyer, someone who could look over the actual contract language and tell me whether Ruth's claim about the advance even held up under any real legal scrutiny at all in court. But between the confidentiality clause I had already signed and the sheer strangeness of everything I would have needed to explain to any lawyer willing to listen to me, that option felt further out of reach with every hour that passed that morning. I drove to St. Regis Valley Medical Center that afternoon, fully intending to demand a copy of my original contract and find a lawyer if I had to, no matter what it cost me in the end to actually do it properly. But somewhere in the 20-minute drive from Saranac Lake, my resolve started to feel less like a firm conviction and more like something already slipping steadily through my own fingers as the miles passed by outside my windshield. It felt the same way Loretta had described her own 2 failed attempts to walk away from that same job decades earlier, back when she had tried and failed at it twice herself for her own private reasons. By the time I sat across from Ruth Callahan in her small office on the 2nd floor, the $11,200 figure sitting between us on her desk in plain black and white ink, I found myself agreeing to finish out the term. Walking away from the job entirely still meant risking a debt collection process I genuinely could not afford to fight through any court anywhere in the entire surrounding region that particular winter. I told myself I would simply be more careful from that point forward, that I would keep my head down, do my rounds properly, and never again press the button for a basement level that was not supposed to exist anywhere in the building's official records. Ruth thanked me warmly for understanding her position, the way she always seemed to do whenever I pushed back against her even slightly during one of our brief conversations together in that small office. As I stood to leave, she added, almost casually, that she hoped I had not taken anything belonging to the hospital during whatever exploring I might have done recently, on my own personal time, off the clock. The comment was delivered without any real accusation in her tone. Nothing sharp or threatening in the way she said it out loud to me across that small, tidy desk of hers that particular gray afternoon. Still, it landed in my stomach like a stone dropped straight down a well, because I had left both the ledger and Whitmore's letter locked inside my car in the parking lot below her office window the entire time we had been sitting there talking. I drove home that evening with the papers still hidden under the spare tire in my trunk, telling myself Ruth could not possibly know for certain what I had or had not taken from that basement office, even as some quiet part of me suspected otherwise the whole drive back. The final 4 months of my contract passed slower than the first 2 had, each individual shift stretching longer than the one before it, or at least it always felt that way to me by that particular point. Nothing as dramatic as the storm night ever happened again in quite the same way, but the smaller wrongness I had noticed at the very beginning grew steadily worse instead of fading the way I kept desperately hoping it eventually would. I started losing small stretches of time the same way Loretta had described to me across her own kitchen table weeks earlier that fall, long before the December storm had ever hit that entire snowy region. I would arrive at the nurse's station for what felt like a single round of vitals checks, only to look up at the clock and find nearly 2 full hours had somehow passed with no memory of where exactly they had gone. Twice, I found my own handwriting filling out sections of the paper logbook with entries I had no recollection of ever having written down myself during any of my rounds on that particular night in question. Those notes read like observations I should have made about patients shifting position or murmuring softly in their sleep, but they existed in my own memory only as a stretch of blank space where those specific minutes should have been sitting instead. Dorothy Finn said my name to me twice more before my contract finally ended that spring, always during that same narrow window between 2 and 3 in the morning when the whole building felt at its emptiest and quietest. Each time her voice sounded a little less like a stranger's, and a little more like something that had carefully learned the exact shape of my own voice, specifically by listening to me talk quietly to myself through the long, empty hours of the night for months on end. That particular detail frightened me more than anything else that happened during those final 4 months, because it meant whatever was down on that lower level was no longer simply reacting to my presence up above it anymore. It was studying me carefully, the way a person might study a language they intended to speak fluently themselves before very much longer, given enough patient time and enough quiet nights alone together in that room. I stopped bringing paperback novels to work sometime around February because I found I could no longer concentrate on any story for more than a page or 2 at a stretch before my mind simply drifted somewhere else entirely, somewhere I could not always account for afterward when I tried. My very last regular shift before the official end of my contract fell on the 12th of April, 2 nights before my 6 months were finally set to conclude for good, and I drove up to Tupper Lake that evening with a strange, hollow feeling sitting low in my stomach the whole way there. The unit felt different to me that particular night, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the usual mechanical silence I had grown so used to over the previous months of working there alone in the dark. I did my rounds exactly as always, checking vitals, logging notes, repositioning anyone who needed it, moving through the motions of a job I had performed hundreds of times by that point without ever once feeling entirely safe doing it. Around 2 in the morning, during what I already suspected might be one of my very last visits to her bedside, Dorothy Finn's eyes opened fully for the first time since that very first night back in October when she had said my name so clearly. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking at all, her expression unreadable in the dim light filtering in from the hallway behind me. And then she said, in that same dry, unused voice, that she was glad it would not be her turn again so soon this time around. I did not understand what she meant by that particular phrase in the moment. Standing there frozen beside her bed, with my clipboard still clutched tightly in one hand, though the words stayed with me long after I finally managed to step back and finish the rest of my round in silence. She closed her eyes again before I could ask her anything else, her breathing slipping back into that same slow, mechanical rhythm it always held whenever I stood there near her bed so late into the night. She did not open them again for the remainder of that particular night, no matter how long I stood there quietly afterward, watching and waiting for her to finally say anything else to me directly, at all. I spent the rest of that final regular shift turning her words over and over in my head, trying hard to decide whether they were meant as some kind of comfort or some kind of warning aimed directly at me personally. By the time my relief finally arrived at 7 o'clock that morning, I still had not settled on any real answer either way, one way or the other, inside my own tired and thoroughly aching head at all. I drove home through the pale early light of an April morning with the heater running full blast against a cold that seemed to have settled somewhere deep in my chest rather than simply in the air outside my car windows. Loretta had told me, weeks earlier, sitting at that same kitchen table, that the ones who stayed on past their original term rarely left the hospital again in any way that actually counted as truly leaving for good. I found myself wondering, driving south along Route 30 in that gray morning light, which particular category I might already belong to by then, whether I had ever fully realized it myself yet or not. The day before my contract officially ended, I drove out to Renata's house on the outskirts of Tupper Lake instead of going straight home to sleep, after finishing my very final regular shift on the unit. I told myself I only wanted to thank her properly for all the small kindnesses she had shown me back during those first confusing weeks I had spent working alone on that unit that fall, uncertain of everything. Really, though, I wanted to ask her directly whether the two of us might go together to a lawyer, or maybe a reporter from one of the papers down in Plattsburgh, and finally tell someone outside that hospital everything we both knew about Ward C and what it actually was. Renata listened to the whole idea standing in her own doorway, arms crossed tightly against the cool evening air. And by the time I finished talking, she was already shaking her head slowly back and forth in a way that told me the answer before she ever said a single word out loud to me. She said she had thought about it herself, more than once, over the years since her own transfer off that unit, and that she had even gotten as far as drafting an email to a reporter one night before deleting it unsent an hour later without any real explanation for why. When I finally asked her why she had stopped herself that particular night, she went quiet for a long moment, staring past me toward the dark tree line running along the far edge of her own snowy property. Then she admitted that she still sometimes woke at exactly 2 in the morning to the sound of that same low, overlapping murmur, even now, more than 20 years after she had last set foot on that particular floor of the hospital. She told me she had come to believe slowly and reluctantly over those 2 decades, that speaking about it too openly, to the wrong person or in the wrong way, might somehow draw more attention back toward herself from whatever still occasionally reached her from that unit late at night. It was not logical, she admitted, and she could not explain the mechanism any better than that, but the fear itself had never once loosened its grip on her, no matter how many years of ordinary daylight nursing work she put safely between herself and that particular corridor. I left her house that evening no closer to any plan for exposing what I knew than I had been when I arrived. And driving home through the dark, I understood, maybe for the first time fully, that Ward C did not only keep its hold on the people who worked inside it, it also kept a quieter, longer hold on everyone who had ever left it behind for good, one that stretched out slowly across years and counties and entire unrelated lives, long afterward, mostly unnoticed. That hold expressed itself less as visible chains and more as a kind of permanent, low-grade dread that never fully released its own grip on anyone it had once touched directly at all. Not ever, truly. I thought about Loretta out in her trailer past Piercefield, and about Renata standing in her own doorway with her arms crossed against a cold that had nothing to do with the actual temperature that evening. I understood that whatever I decided to do or not do about any of it, I would likely be carrying some version of that same quiet dread for the rest of my own life. However far away from Tupper Lake, I eventually managed to move myself. My contract officially ended on the 14th of April, exactly 6 months to the day after that very first shift back in October, when I had walked in there knowing almost nothing at all about the place. I drove to the hospital one final time that evening, not to work, but to collect my last paycheck in person and to tell Ruth Callahan directly that I would not be accepting any kind of extension at all. I had decided in the weeks leading up to that date that I would rather live with whatever remained of the original signing advance's debt than spend one more single night anchored to that particular basement level below the hospital. Ruth accepted my decision with the same calm, unbothered warmth she had shown every single time I had ever pushed back against her before. Over the long months we had spent working together on that unit, she thanked me sincerely for my service to the ward, speaking as though I had spent 6 months doing nothing more unusual than routine administrative paperwork, rather than everything I had actually witnessed and lived through down there. She told me the hospital would begin advertising the position again within the week, since Ward C could never simply sit unstaffed for any real length of time without someone eventually noticing the gap and asking uncomfortable questions about it. As I turned to leave her office for what I sincerely believed at the time would be the very last occasion, she mentioned, almost as a passing courtesy, that the $11,200 advance would now be considered fully repaid through my completed 6 months of service on the unit. That was a piece of information she had somehow neglected to share with me back when that same exact figure had originally talked me out of quitting early, 4 long months earlier in her own office, on that same worn carpet. I walked out through the main lobby for what felt like the 100th time that year, past the tired-looking waiting room chairs and the community bulletin board still advertising a blood drive from sometime back in February. Outside, in the empty parking lot, the last of the winter snow had finally melted down into gray, gritty slush pooling along the curb lines under the dim streetlights hanging above the whole silent lot. I sat in my car for a long while before actually starting the engine, watching the lit windows of the hospital through my windshield and trying to memorize the particular shape of that third-floor corridor from the outside. Ward C sat quiet and waiting behind that dark glass the way it always had, day and night, for as long as I had known anything at all about its own quiet existence up there, or perhaps ever really would. Somewhere up there, behind glass, I could not quite pick out from that distance in the dark. Dorothy Fenn and Walter Kessler and the other 4 patients I had cared for over the past 6 months were almost certainly lying exactly the way I had left them only minutes earlier. Their eyes were closed, their breathing slow and mechanical as ever, waiting quietly for whoever came along next to finally take up the exact same post that I was walking away from that night for good. I thought about Loretta, still living alone out past Piercefield after all these decades, still occasionally waking in the night convinced she could hear that same low, overlapping murmur drifting through her trailer walls from somewhere far away. I thought about Renata, who had lasted 11 months on that unit before finding her own way out through a transfer rather than an outright resignation, and about all those other names filling page after page of that stolen ledger, still hidden beneath the spare tire in my own trunk. Finally, I started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot onto the dark stretch of Route 30, and drove south towards Saranac Lake without once looking back in my rearview mirror at the building shrinking slowly behind me in the cold night air. I have not set foot inside St. Regis Valley Medical Center since that particular April evening, and for the first few weeks afterward, I genuinely believed I had gotten out of there completely clean. I believed that whatever thin, invisible thread connects an anchor to the thing it holds steadily down had simply snapped itself clean the very moment my contract officially ended for good that spring. I took a new job at an urgent care clinic in Saranac Lake that paid far less than $62 an hour, closer to $28 an hour if I'm being fully honest about the real numbers involved. I told myself the difference was worth every single dollar of it, though, for the ordinary daylight hours and the ordinary patients who complained about ordinary things like sprained ankles and summer colds. I burned the ledger and Whitmore's letter together in a metal trash can behind my apartment building on a warm evening in May, standing there and watching the pages curl and blacken slowly in the heat. Nothing at all remained of either one afterward but gray, fine ash that I scattered out slowly into the wind blowing steadily off the lake near my apartment building that particular warm May evening, alone. I told myself that small act had finally severed whatever connection I had made to that place during my 6 months of working there alone, through all those long, cold, strange nights of watching over strangers. I told myself fire could undo what 6 months of nights alone in that basement had apparently failed to undo for Dr. Whitmore himself. Decades earlier, no matter how hard he had tried near the very end of his own life, but the gaps in my memory never once actually stopped the way I had expected them to. Once I finally stopped driving up to Tupper Lake every single evening the way I had for 6 long months straight through. Even now, sitting somewhere far away from that building myself, months later, I still occasionally lose an hour or two in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, with no real explanation for where exactly it all went. Some nights always somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning according to the little clock sitting on my own nightstand. When I finally do wake up, I find myself standing at my own front door again. My hand rests on the cold deadbolt, and I have no memory whatsoever of getting out of bed or crossing the entire length of my own dark, silent apartment to reach that particular spot by the door each time. I stand there in the dark, facing the empty street outside through the little window set into the door itself, as though I were listening very carefully for something quite specific out there in the night. Or perhaps something out there, on the other side of that door, is listening just as carefully for me instead, waiting patiently the way Ruth Callahan always seemed to wait for everything, without any real hurry at all in her voice. My sister Callie noticed the change in me almost immediately when I visited her for a long weekend down in Plattsburgh that same June, not long after I had finally left the whole job behind me for good. She told me I seemed distracted in a way she had never once seen in me before that weekend. Distant, like part of me was always somewhere else entirely, even while I sat right there across the table from her. I told her it was just the leftover exhaustion from 6 months of night shifts finally catching up with my whole body all at once. An explanation that seemed to satisfy her reasonably well enough at the time. It did nothing at all, though, to actually satisfy the small cold feeling that had settled itself permanently somewhere deep behind my own ribs since that particular April evening up in Tupper Lake that year. I checked the regional staffing board again 2 weeks ago, out of a compulsion I still cannot fully explain to myself even now, sitting here trying to put all of this down on paper for reasons I do not entirely understand either. The overnight caretaker listing for Ward C at St. Regis Valley Medical Center was already back up on the site, the hourly pay rate exactly the same as it had been the first time I saw it that October. The job description itself read just as short and just as strange as it had always been to anyone encountering it there for the very first time, without knowing a single thing about what it actually meant. Ruth Callahan's own name still sat listed there as the contact at the very bottom of the posting, patient and unhurried as ever, apparently willing to wait exactly as long as it always eventually takes. She would simply wait, however long it eventually took her, for the next person carrying enough debt and enough desperation to finally pick up the phone and place that particular call themselves, the way I once had. I do not know who will eventually answer that particular listing, whether it will be someone from 3 counties over the way I once was myself, or someone closer to home who has simply never heard the stories the way I eventually did, across Loretta's own kitchen table. I only know that somewhere on the 3rd floor of that hospital, behind a badge-locked set of double doors at the end of a quiet corridor, 6 beds are waiting the way they have been waiting since 1957. They wait patient and unhurried, in exactly the same way Ruth Callahan always was herself, for whoever comes next to sit with them through the long, dark hours between 2 and 3 in the morning, alone,